You're listening to The Valley Current.
Hey, morning, Daniel. Thank you, Dr.
How are you?
For coming into The Valley Current. Thank you so much. I've wanted to do this podcast with you for over a decade. In fact, probably a couple of decades since we resolved that patent litigation years ago, because I've always viewed you as the entrepreneurial medical doctor that sort of was a pioneer in the area of acquiring, creating, and using intellectual property rights derived from inventions created from your practice, from your knowledge and your practice, which I think most doctors don't realize. They very often are inventors as well as they proceed with their practice. So I'd love you to tell the story of how you got there, because I know it's quite an interesting story. And it's another example of someone coming to the U.S. and becoming a very important person in the field that you're in and in the inventions that you created. So tell us sort of your journey of how you got to the medical profession. I know you were born overseas, so tell us about that.
Well, it was a story of necessity. What happened was I trained in plastic surgery, and I became a young plastic surgeon, and I joined, and I was asked to join a very impressive practice in New York City, and found out that they, were dealing with breast implant issues and problems, and not just that, but it's one of the most common surgeries performed in plastic surgery anyway. And I disagreed with what was being done, and I started calling people, senior people that I knew, and I found out that everyone was doing the same thing. And I said to myself, there's got to be a different solution. The issue was that there were polyurethane breast implants, and those polyurethane breast implants, in my opinion, had problems or potential problems. The long and short result of that was that several years later, the polyurethane breast implants were taken off the market by pressure of the FDA. But that's in essence what happened.
You were really ahead of your time in seeing something that the manufacturers obviously wanted to ignore, and the federal government, in its bureaucracies and as slow as it is, often will take a much longer period of time to evaluate and judge. And yet, like you, will see it well in advance. And then you came up with a much more improved approach that resulted in a number of patents that were issued in your favor.
Thank you. I said to myself that there's got to be another solution here. And the solutions that I really wanted to propose, that I did propose, that were to go away from silicone as a implantable prosthetic device, because I didn't think that silicone was the ideal material. I thought that something like a Gore-Tex, for example, would have been a better choice. And because it has a long history in the human body, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I still believe that.
Well, stitches are typically made out of Gore-Tex, aren't they?
Some are, and some patches, tissue patches. Gore-Tex is a long history in the human body. And actually it's really interesting because when I was training at Albert Einstein in New York, that was one of the earliest places where Gore-Tex vascular grafts that are basically the state of the art were tried. And I thought, the Gore-Tex, I've had experience, basic experience with it, a clinical experience. And I said to myself, this is a better material. It has many more advantages to silicone. Right. I had many doubts about silicone. And actually, it brings us to today because, the silicone implants now that are textured, which is what I thought would make them a little better, have actually resulted in some rare cancers now. But my idea was not silicone. Silicone was my last choice.
Right.
And the reason why I had to do silicone was because that was the industry standard, and to go through the FDA with any new material would have been impossible. But right. I bring it up, and the interesting thing is that I thought Gore-Tex would be a good material, and I don't know if you recall that someone in California, in LA, I think, decided to try Gore-Tex. They tried it in a way that they took breast implants and covered them with Gore-Tex, and it worked. Mm-hmm. It just worked exactly as predicted. I didn't do the essential work, but that person did. I mean, they had a similar idea several years later. And if you recall, they wanted to, license the patents and so on and so forth. I don't know where it went, but that was, I think it basically was a proof of concept.
Right.
And,
So let's go back to like when you were a child. Did you have an idea that you wanted to be a medical doctor? Tell us that journey, because I'm always amazed at how people end up getting to the profession that they choose and excelling in it the way you did, to the point where now I think you told me the other day, you're going to get another medical license, or maybe you've already gotten one from Texas as you think about contemplating expanding your practice from New York to, I guess, the western part of the United States, or heading west, young man, heading west, just generally.
Yes. Here's a conflict of opinions. Mm-hmm. I have an older brother who is, 2 years older than I am. He's also a doctor. We're the generation that every kid that grew up was either an attorney or a doctor.
Right.
That was it.
Right.
Those were the choices.
Right.
Or an accountant, maybe. Mm-hmm. But that's it. And those were our choices. So my brother tells me that, and I don't have any recollection, that when I was a very weird child, it seems, because he said to me that when I was asked at the age of 13, whatever, what do you want to be? And I said plastic surgeon.
Really?
And that's very strange. I have no memory of it,
wow.
But he's absolutely certain. He's absolutely, and trust me, he would not tell me something that he didn't think, because he wouldn't,
So it actually happened. And do you remember, that was the age in my mind, because we're sort of the same generation, when, Playboy magazine was kind of like the magazine that all the teenagers would want to get their hands on. And it wasn't, when you look at it now, it's really not that racy. If you go back to the magazines from the 1950s, the Playboy type magazines, they're not as racy as what you see even in the newspaper today. The newspapers have more racy photos, but was it generated from some adoration towards the female or male body, or was it something different, do you think?
It was something totally different, because we had no Playboy magazines. I've never seen one at that point. Never hardly heard one about one. Playboy for me became more of a reality. The entire empire and the whole idea of Playboy was more when I had already graduated from medical school, but it was not a big deal. In London, I remember visiting London, and at the time, the Playboy thing was very big in London. Right. If you recall the bars and the this and the that, I've never been to one ever in my life.
Interesting.
I'm not a saint, but I've never done that.
Right, but you've seen a lot of female bodies. I mean, you have had a practice now for going on 40 plus years, or maybe longer.
Yeah. Tell you what the connection is. I believe my father was a tailor and a designer, and he was very talented, and he did haute couture.
Okay.
Actually, when we grew up in Israel, the prime minister's limo, whatever, would stop in front of the house, and prime minister's wife came, because my father was making her, the clothes and so on and so forth. So he was very well known in Israel at the time, and he was very talented. But he was really an artist. I mean, temperamentally also, he had a temper.
Right.
My mother had to run the business there because, otherwise he'd tell off all his clients.
Right.
But very talented. He knew how to draw. I mean, I have paintings in the house that he when he retired in his 80s, he decided he was going to draw and paint. Never took a lesson in his life. Beautiful stuff, So it's a natural talent, and I think that in that way, I often was even looking at my hands, and they look like his, they move like his, and they look like his.
Well, to be a surgeon,
and when I was
to be a surgeon, you have to have dexterity, right? You have to be good with your hands.
That was never a problem for me. It was not. It was just, thank God, and that was it. But for me, it was not so much the art. I was always a science geek, and the science really is what I believed in and wanted to do, and to understand how things work, inventions. I was always fascinated by inventions, the way that I saw, read about it, because we didn't have television. And we had radio and books. So I would just read and think about these things. I still remember thinking about James Watt, the steam engines, and thinking about the original story of how something was boiling and it was rattling, the top was rattling.
Right.
And he got the idea of the strength of steam. So all these stories, really, I was impressionable.
Right.
And that is what I was thinking.
Interesting. So do you think your schooling in Israel played a role? Like if you go back to those early days of grade school and high school in Israel, or did you go to high school in Israel or some other country?
No, I went to, I was born in 46. I was a true baby boomer. My older brother was born on D-Day.
Wow.
Of all things.
Wow. And
my parents, managed to escape from Europe just in time in 1939, and managed to basically looking for a place, and they found themselves. They met in Israel or in Palestine at the time, and so that is how I grew up. No, I was just a regular kid, I preferred going out and playing with my friends and sitting down and studying.
Right. Then you made your way to another school in another country, though, didn't you?
Yeah, in Sydney. My aunt, who was Hungarian, my father was Hungarian, my mother is German. So he's from Budapest and she's from Berlin. And my aunt, my father's younger sister, she survived the Holocaust in Budapest, and then she came to Israel and lived with us for a while, and so she never had children. They never had children. So over the years, they couldn't make it in Israel because it was pretty harsh conditions in the 50s in Israel.
Right.
So they left for Sydney. Australia, and she had a business there. She was also in the same business. She was also a designer, and she was very artistic. When I was in the military, she came up for a visit from Sydney and said, "Gee, why don't you come to Australia?" And I thought, well, it's a good idea, but and then there was a 6-day war in Israel, and after the war, I just completed my service. Just after the war, I basically, and I said, listen, I can't get into any school now because, I do not have time to study or do anything because it was that time of the year. Why not Australia? Prior to that, just for interest's sake, I just applied for law school in Tel Aviv, and I got in. I said,
I didn't know you applied for law school. That's news to me. I didn't realize that. I've known you all these years.
Actually, I was accepted. I was accepted And I said, you know what? That's not for me. Thank you.
Wow. So that's where the patent stuff probably played some role in the back
possibly.
of your mind. Interesting. I didn't know that. So do you think it was a good thing that your parents moved to Australia? Because
No, my parents didn't move. I was just after a war, which was very dangerous for us, because the enemy was 30 miles from Tel Aviv, and they were all, how it went.
Right.
And we somehow, survived it all. Lost a few friends and things like that. So, sort of you grow up quickly.
Right.
And I said, okay, fine. So I'll, beats working. I'm going to go to Sydney.
Wow.
and applied to medicine, dentistry, and science at the university there in that order.
Okay.
And, there was an entrance exam, and I said, what am I going to do? I haven't been at school for 3 years because it was, at that point I just turned 21 and I had spent 3 years in the army.
Right.
That story was amusing because that was my entrance exam. So I got to, there was no sense in studying. What am I going to study? They gave me 2 weeks before. They said, you have an entrance exam.
Right.
I said, fine. I went there and I still remember entering the office of the professor of, I think he was a professor. I'm not sure what professor he was, but he was one of the professors there.
Right.
And he was the one that going to do my exam.
Right.
So obviously that was just after the war, and it was worldwide news at the time. And he says, "Oh, you're from Israel?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, and he starts telling me about what the thinking was about the war. And I have a big mouth, and I said to him, no, that's not how it goes. So I started correcting him on his facts. And we had a lively conversation, which was really nice because, it was a give and take. And it was really an enjoyable.
That's when he knew that he had the right student. He had someone that was pushing back.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I was correcting his facts because I was in it. I was in the war, and he wasn't.
Right. I mean, he was in Australia, which was so far away from really any of the real action.
Yeah, and I had already been a first lieutenant in the military, so I knew a little bit about it. And I said to him, and at the end of the interview, it was really funny. He said to me, "Well, Mr. Brauman, you speak English very well." I said, "Well, thank you." That was the end of my exam.
Right.
Next thing I know I get a letter, you were accepted.
Right.
It was really funny.
That's such a good story because I imagine even to this day, Australia in general and Sydney in particular must be a very fond memory for you, right?
It is. It's phenomenal. I would have stayed there. It was great. I had there are not too many. There are only 2 of us, I believe, that were in essence in a class of, in a medical school class of 200 approximately, that did not go to high school in Sydney,
right,
or in Australia.
Right.
I was one, and the other one was another gentleman, African,
right,
who ended up, we didn't like each other in the beginning, but we ended up being best friends. And then we, at the end of our medical school, we did actually Europe for $5 a day. If you
really? Okay. That's really interesting. That's really interesting.
And he ended up being, I can't say where and what, but because, it's for security, African people, prominent people, it's always a problem to have them, their security is an issue. So he ended up being the Minister of Health of his country.
Interesting. I've always thought that sooner or later, this is just a footnote to the story, I've always thought sooner or later there would be some business that would arise out of Facebook, like a consulting business, that would essentially get from you a list of names of all the people that you were students with or you were colleagues with. And then they would do the work of finding all these people on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. And then you would have this ability to really remember everyone that you've connected with over the years and realize what little they, or what great things or little things they did to move you or influence you in a particular direction. And so far, I haven't seen that happen. I haven't seen a real consulting business. Interestingly, on the flip side, there's a business associated with Ancestry.com, which goes backwards in time. So look at all your ancestors. And there is a business where there are professionals that literally will do the research to say, I'll take your predecessors going back, I'll do all the work to find everyone connected to your aunt and your uncle, your mom, your dad, your grandfather. But so far on a forward basis, at least I haven't seen it. It hasn't yet arisen. Now, maybe it will, maybe it exists and I haven't just seen it. But I imagine you'd love to reconnect with some of these people, and maybe you could on Facebook and LinkedIn, although it might take some work to find them, right?
Well, you know, with this particular friend of mine, actually, he visited me here in New York a few years ago. You know, it's hard to get hold of him in his country because you know these people need to keep a low profile. You know, right. the people who were I mean, he's a doctor basically,
right,
and he just and he was not looking for the political post, but he ended up falling into it because he was a doctor.
Right.
You know, where he was,
right.
And when I was working with the American College of Surgeons during the Ebola crisis. And all of a sudden, you know, we were at the conference in San Francisco, actually, and Ebola crisis started. And nobody knew what and how, you know, how do you diagnose, how long you keep people isolated and so on and so forth, and what do you do? Right. How do you diagnose them? You know, because Ebola is so infectious. It goes back to what we are facing now with COVID.
Right. I wanted to cover that. I wanted to cover that with you, but just give me a second here and let me say, you've told me three things that now have me understanding better how you became the inventor of the patents, which we litigated for you. And we ended up taking a case that I guess every other law firm refused to take because they had. I want you to tell that story, but let me tell you the three things you told me that I didn't know before. Number one, your dad was an artist and also an artisan and a tailor. So you have an eye for aesthetics and an eye for design from your dad. Number two, your mom was a business person. So you also have sort of the genes from your mom associated with running a business, helping your dad or their tailoring business or the haute couture business that they had. So it's the second thing. And the third thing, that you got into law school. So you had a certain sort of element of, hey, I got to be aware that the law sort of sets the rules of the game. And in the era of patents, which obviously we've really become an era of patents and a creativity economy, you were ahead of the curve of saying, hey, I've discovered something here. Let me get some patents written, or let me write and get a lawyer to file for me the claims associated with those patents. We didn't do that work, but we ended up taking on the litigation challenge against the incumbents, which my recollection is it was a duopoly of two different companies, or maybe three different companies, one of which went out of business, but two of which survived, and maybe one of which survived. And we ended up winning those cases in the courts, in the federal courts in New York, which I remember you were quite happy about because the other lawyers were all like, no, we can't do it. It's too challenging. They're big companies. You'll have a hard time. You may want to tell us a little bit about that, but I think I've summarized three things that I hadn't heard of or known about you before that I just learned literally after knowing you for a couple of decades, maybe going on 3 decades at this point.
Yes. And we've been friends ever since. You know, you connect with people and somehow you see in someone, and I saw in you, you know, the qualities that I admired and the way that you did it. I mean, I have never heard, and I'm not sure if it exists, you know, there were latches which are basically that would have precluded any litigation just on its face.
Right.
and you took this case on assignment to boot. And I said to myself, gee, it was sort of a long shot. Mm-hmm. And you went in and on assignment took it. And that was quite impressive at the very least. And you brought two multinational corporations to their knees with the statute of limitation basically having passed.
Right.
Still, you brought two multinational corporations to their knees in 7 months.
Right.
And if you recall, I made them, because I was getting really annoyed, I made them also sign a declaration that, about my contribution to the field, because which they never do, because I said, this is not about the money.
Right.
This is, you better own up to what you've done, that you basically took that art and had no problems doing what you did.
Right,
so you better write down, or else the deal is off.
Right. I hope you have that letter framed. I always thought
I do.
You do have that letter framed, and so I want you to send me a picture of it, because I've said that to people in my office. I said to, and I had I have a good team now. I had a good team then, although lots of people have since retired. And I remember at the time, a couple of people on the team were like, so why are we doing this? And I think I said something like, this is the genuine inventor patentee that actually is trying to clear his name as the inventor. It's not just about money. I mean, we really shouldn't look at this as about money. This is the guy who really deserves credit. And they really couldn't believe it. They were like, what? Really? And I said, yes, that is actually the role of the patent system, to award a patent to someone who is the inventor and is entitled to have that reputational advantage. And people were like, well, that's not what really happens in real life, because companies acquire patents and then enforce them. And of course, the world has changed dramatically. You don't really see individual inventors like you go up against multinational companies anymore, because the odds are so stacked against them. But you were a pioneer in that respect too. And I think you could write, and I think I've said this to you, you could write a separate book about that whole case and about the creation of that art and the creation of the patents, and then the things that happened that resulted in the long period of time that passed because of all the product liability litigation that existed. There's such a rich story there that could tell the story of these companies and how much money they've made over time and how much damage they did with the products that they had that were not as state-of-the-art as they should have been. And at the end of the day, I have to say that would be a very interesting Netflix series in my mind, because so many women, I think, have suffered. And yet the business is still a real business, right? Albeit it's a different set of products at this point. But in many ways, I have to believe that that's not going away. People, not only women, men too, want to have plastic surgery and want to have implants and want to do things to their body in ways that have created Netflix pictures of the extreme versions. I don't know if you've seen some of these extreme stories. They must make you laugh, right?
What happens is that all of a sudden you see sort of a news flash of something. Wow, we have this incredible invention, and you say to yourself, what are you talking about? This existed 20, 30 years ago already. All of a sudden you call it a different name, and now it's a news flash. Okay, fine. It's promotion.
Right.
There have been very few, in my opinion, really substantial inventions, substantial advances in certain fields, that are noteworthy. Some of them are not even noteworthy, but people obviously know how to promote, and that is part of life. And I'm not belittling it, but it is what it is, and it's okay. But at the same time, when you look at the substance of what is being done, it's hard to sit there and say, gee, and get sort of impressed by some of these things,
Right.
Because it's a repetition of the same thing with a tiny little twist. And even the tiny little twist has been done before.
Right.
I mean, the idea of nothing new under the sun is not really true, but at the same time, it's a good version of it.
Right. Well, Apple Computer is a good example. I think they have thousands, if not tens of thousands of patents on these little tiny improvements. And we laugh because we say to ourselves, the patent system is clogged with these little tiny little light improvements. And the pioneers kind of get lost. And you were one of the pioneers in your particular area. And the footnote I want to drop here is that people don't realize that 85 to 90+% of patents never actually commercialize to money. They just get filed almost like vanity filings, and corporations are the worst examples of this because they file, and there's a lot of patents that create a lot of work for people to figure out what the heck are there. But only like maybe 10 to maybe 15% actually do result in commercialization like yours and actual payment, because there can be commercialization, which is called infringement, and then non-payment because people like, go pursue us. You'll be tied up in the courts for years, if not decades.
That's right.
And
That's right.
You're the rare case.
No, you're the rare case, I must say. No, I could not get anyone to take it even for free. And I offered the patents to Cornell Medical School.
Right.
And the patent attorney there, because I had connections there, and the patent attorney said, we have so many like this invented by people, of the faculty people.
Right.
I don't need any more work.
Let's turn for a second to your new invention, because you are familiar with Ebola and viruses, and you are doing some thinking in an area that's very hot right now, which is this COVID-19 and its variants, plural.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode of The Valley Current.